Great. Thank you so much, Andre, for such a kind introduction. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Such an honor to be here, and I'm really liking everything from the town to be in front of you today. So yeah, like what Andre said before, this is my new project, which came after my PhD thesis. So my PhD thesis explored the issue of drought in Zimbabwe, colonial to post-colonial, basically looking at the environmental, social, political, and economic setting of drought and how different actors negotiated power, how different actors responded to drought in Zimbabwe. So in that project, I basically look at various drought responses, economic, social, environmental responses. But then one thing that came out that I do not explore in that thesis is how post-1947, the colonial government became more interested in cloud seeding experiments. Interested broadly in weather modification, but in particular in cloud seeding experiments is a major drought response strategy. And that shaped some climate politics, regional, local, and sort of died down in post-immediate post-colonial period, only to be renewed in recent years, which is something that I will explore today. Does this work? No, don't mind.
Okay.
I can work this out, right? That's okay.
Yeah. No, it does not work.
Don't worry about it. So in present day Zimbabwe, past 2-3 years, there have been renewed interests in cloud seeding. In that newspaper screenshot that I put up there, that's a state newspaper, the Herald, that reported in 2023 that the 2022-2023 season, the Meteorological Services Department decided to carry out a cloud seeding operation. Interestingly, at the same time, you have the president of the country talking about the role of chiefs in traditional rain-making ceremonies, whereby basically communities led by their chiefs go and pray for rain and believe that they can, rains come from the gods. So they have to pray and do certain things to propitiate the ancestors, the gods, for rains to fall. So this is happening at the same time where the same government is launching a cloud seeding operation. The leader of the government is also thinking about the traditional rainmaking ceremony. So it really makes us think about how this idea of cloud seeding or this idea of artificial simulation of rain is a history in the country. It's not really something that is just happening in the present day, but we can trace it from as far back as the immediate post-independence period. So the current cloud seeding experiment is not new in the history of Zimbabwe. The colonial government itself, between 1947 and 1980, experimented with cloud seeding, the efficacy of it being something that is very debatable, but the effort is really visible in all its programs. Yet you have in the immediate post-independence period, the government not really actively participating in the cloud seeding program until these recent years. So what really happened and why? So this study that I'm engaging in then situates the history of cloud seeding in colonial and post-colonial Zimbabwe in the broader global and regional scholarship on weather forecasting and cloud seeding experiment. So first of all, the colonial government itself was very much interested in events that were happening in the nearby South Africa, and more importantly, in the US, to an extent of actually sending people to observe, get trained about weather modification in the United States of America. So basically, you have huge scholarship, huge literature on weather modification in the US, beginning with the establishment of the Weather Modification Association in 1950, which led to the establishment of a Journal of Weather Modification, which has published a lot of journal articles, about 22 volumes until 2022. And they cover various themes. Some of them are peer-reviewed, some of them are not peer-reviewed, exploring different aspects of weather modification, be it cloud seeding, warm fog modification, hail suppression, storm modification, snowpack augmentation. A lot of things that are covered in articles that are published in that journal. Also, there is recent literature in the US itself about cloud seeding. In particular, I'm more interested in the book by Harper titled Make It Rain, State Control of Atmosphere in 20th Century America, which looks at the huge funding that was put into the idea of weather modification and how weather modification became part of the foreign and both foreign policy and local policy in the US itself. So it became a dominant discourse in 20th century America. So in that book, Harper also weaves together the story of how federal officials, politicians, bureaucrats, military leaders, or diplomats pursued their goal of producing designer weather on demand, even as meteorologists were struggling to figure out how the atmosphere functioned, how it modeled, and how to make viable weather and climate forecasts. So you really see how broader relations are shaped and broader aspects are occurring as a result of experiments with weather modification. And then in Southern African literature, you really have a few scholars on South Africa because it began to experiment with cloud seeding also in the immediate post-Second World War period, 1950s. So you have scholars mostly in the 20th century on South Africa trying to examine the efficiency of the cloud seeding experiments. And one of the major sources that have been produced is the 1993 report that tried to measure the efficiency of the 1983 to 1992 experiments that were a consolidated experiment with cloud seeding in different regions of South Africa. And the report actually praised it to be successful and eventually recommended that other sectors of the economy should be incorporated in this planning, especially to try and solve the water scarcity problem. But in Zimbabwe, you hardly have literature on cloud seeding. The only glimpse of literature is McNaughton's article titled Cloud Seeding Effect on Water Stress of Maize in Zimbabwe. And McNaughton himself was a former official of the Meteorological Services Department in colonial Zimbabwe. So he was actually involved in some cloud seeding experiments. So he then produced an article in 1982. That was actually a follow-up article to his PhD thesis that had been submitted in 1980, basically talking about how cloud seeding might have enhanced harvest or output, agricultural output in a particular region of Zimbabwe. He also observes the shortfall of his research, considering the fact that the region that he focuses in normally receives normal to above normal rainfall. But that's how scant literature on cloud seeding is in the Zimbabwean context and Southern Africa in broad, which I try then to sort of join and try to document this history of cloud seeding in weather modification in general and cloud seeding specifically in Zimbabwe. I'm trying to think of weather modification in colonial Zimbabwe as an Anthropocene moment in Zimbabwe. So if Anthropocene is characterized by agricultural revolutions, industrial revolutions, technological transformations elsewhere, how might we think of the Anthropocene in the context of Africa, in the context of Zimbabwe? Of course, there are human activities that have contributed to climate change, contributed to human domination of our nature, such as deforestation, desertification, pollution. But I'm trying to imagine and trace anthropogenic environmental change in Zimbabwe using the idea of weather modification, where efforts were made to try and control the environment, to try and particularly control the weather as a national response to drought. So this, much of the evidence about this has been centered on the documentations done by the Meteorological Services Department of colonial Zimbabwe. And the department itself, since establishment, tried as much as possible to get and know and also advise farmers and the general population about the climatic conditions in colonial Zimbabwe. And this was because when Zimbabwe was colonized in 1890, and one of the main interests that incoming settlers had was mining. But in the early 1890s, it was discovered that mining was not going to result into huge business. So there was need to diversify into agriculture. And Southern Rhodesia first became a settler colony as opposed to a non-settler colony. So there was a huge settler population in Zimbabwe. So the government tried as much as possible to offer assistance to these farmers through research, through funding, through labor recruitment, among other efforts. So in terms of weather, because of recurring droughts, the Meteorological Services Department was set up, and between 1890s and 1939, it collected monthly weather reports. It was able to predict meteorological and hydrological forecasts. It was also able to advise agricultural departments, the public in general, about the occurrence of meteorological and hydrological drought, among other weather reports. So one of also its main achievements during this period was the ability to categorize the country into 6 rainfall zones demarcated by the main rivers of the country and separated by outstanding physical features, making it possible to observe the variation of rainfall from place to place and season to season. So basically, in its efforts to try and assist farmers and the general public during this period until 1939, the Meteorological Services Department made an effort to understand the climatic patterns in Zimbabwe, in Southern Africa. It relied on, early in the colonial period, it relied much on information from the Cape Colony in South Africa. The Cape Colony of South Africa had been colonized since 1652. There were information or the technology of weather forecast had developed over centuries. And by this time in the early colonial period, the Meteorological Services Department of Zimbabwe was relying much on that information. But later on, it managed to develop its own technologies, setting up different collection points to collect amounts of rainfall received, among other things. And by 1939, it was able to predict droughts. It was able to advise farmers on weather patterns. It was also able to, after categorizing the country into 6 rainfall zones, was able to also advise farmers on the regions where livestock could fare better than maize production, tobacco production, among other things. So by 1939, we can say it had mastered the idea of, it had mastered the Zimbabwean climate in general. On the outbreak of the war, the department stopped operating and resumed in 1946. After that resumption, in 1947, it then made an observation that there have been cloud seeding experiments in the US and in South Africa. It, however, acknowledged that it did not have the capacity to try and start the experiments. It did not have the technology. It also did not have the experts who could do that, but it was really interested. And between 1947 and the early 1960s, it used to send officials from the Meteorological Services Department to meteorological services conferences in the US, showing its interest. But basically, this technology of cloud seeding that it was mostly interested in. Funny enough, the name says cloud seeding, but it does not necessarily seed clouds. So basically, a couple of options where the idea is to inject a chemical, silver iodide, on top of a particular cloud. It's not every cloud that they have to seed, what they call seeding silver iodide. It's not every cloud, but they have to know specific clouds. And in particular, these are clouds that have a potential to induce rain, but they may not rain without being seeded. So they're just enhancing the probability of rain. So they managed to have that idea, that know-how, but without the technical expertise to carry out the operation. So from 1947 to around 1960s, the early 1960s, up to 1964, the government itself is more or less silent about it. But because this idea had penetrated into society, you then have a lot of media coverage about weather control in Southern Rhodesia, as the colony was known then, during this period. And this media coverage gives an idea of an imagined Anthropocene moment in colonial Zimbabwe at this point in time. There are three main themes that come into that media coverage, specifically in the state media, state newspaper called the Sunday Mail, where you have almost on a weekly publication, there is a comment about the idea of weather modification. Three major themes that come out are the beliefs about weather modification and the imagination of what controlled weather would seem like or would appear like. So basically, the beliefs were centered on the both traditional beliefs of indigenous prayers for rain and also some Christian prayers for rain that had occurred in the colony in the since the colonial period up until the 1940s. And you have comments like prayers for rain exist in both indigenous culture and Christianity in Southern Rhodesia. In the early colonial period, before there were many churches, some white farmers with paged land imported a person. A service was held under a big tree and prayers for rain were offered. Some people believed prayers were dependent on wind direction. And there is a person in a location called Gweru who refused to pray for rain until the wind changed. So these were beliefs about how weather could be controlled through human effort that are coming out of these from these newspaper coverage. But more interestingly is what imagined weather control appeared like in state media. What these publishers, these people who wrote articles in state media, thought of how the Anthropocene moment would be like, how controlled weather would appear like. One of the publications in 1956 began with this quote: "Too much rain. Press a button for a sunny day. Scientists are planning to control the weather. Rain, hail, and snow can already be made to order, and within 10 years, our whole climate may be as closely controlled as the temperature in your living room. Meteorologists expect to organize the most suitable weather areas for weeks ahead. Their published forecasts will be as accurate as the forecast of radio programs. Holiday makers will benefit from hot, dry days planned for holidays, for holiday resorts all the summer. No longer need sun lovers look enviously to Spain and the south of France. Gardens and farms will be watered by gentle rainfall at night. Farmers will benefit when rain is diverted from their ripening maize and tobacco. Cabbages and carrots in other areas will make better use of it. Rain stops play will be an ahead event during test matches." So this imagination represents the diverse nature of the impact of lack of rain, or the diverse nature of the impact of also too much rain, where in these imaginations, people have what they think a controlled weather would look like. However, for Southern Rhodesia's Meteorological Department and majority farmers, weather modification was essential to increase crop output. For others in the society, it was supposed to ensure weather modeled along everyone's needs or everyone's wants. And the opinion in state media envisioned the multiple benefits of controlling the weather. This article in 1956 ended by saying the material benefits of weather control will be enormous. A phone call to the weather bureau and an artificial storm can be created to extinguish a forest fire. Fog and floods will be only of historical interest. Transport will not be disrupted by sleet and ice roads. Like so many advances in science, weather control could now be used as a weapon or a threat. Balloons and rockets could seed clouds over enemy territory to prevent rain from reaching growing crops. Torrential rain could be used to bog down enemy transport, and artificial fog could give protection to ground troops. Control of rain is only the beginning. Scientists envisage alteration and control of the entire climate of Earth. Perhaps they've managed to do that, but not intentionally. Ocean currents will be diverted to warm coastal areas. Tiny plants known as algae will be made to grow on ice caps to absorb sunlight and melt the ice. Dust bowls will be eliminated and deserts made to bloom. Man is going to remodel his planet, and weather control is his first step. And indeed, this was an imagined Anthropocene moment where humans would have total control over their climate. Humans would be able to model their climate according to their needs. Some of the other newspaper titles read like "Rain to Order may be on the way." So there was really an imagined Anthropocene moment just before the actual rain-making cloud seeding experiments were carried out by the Meteorological Services Department. But also another theme that comes in these newspaper articles is the reality of what was obtaining in Rhodesia at the time. I hope I don't confuse you with these names of Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. It's basically the names of colonial Zimbabwe. At one point, it's Southern Rhodesia. After what was Northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia, it gained its independence. It then became just Rhodesia. That is 1964 to 1979. And at independence in 1980, it becomes Zimbabwe. So my apologies for interchanging the use of Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and Zimbabwe. So the other thing that is coming out is the reality that there was no expertise to carry out these experiments. There was no expertise trying to model the climate according to the needs of everyone in the society as imagined. So at this point in time, this Anthropocene moment is sort of lingering in the air and is not really being experienced, although there's really much desire that is being observed in state media. But then in 1964, as a result of a prolonged drought between 1964 and 1966, the government, through the Meteorological Services Department, then carried out an experiment at cloud seeding using what they called rain rockets. And basically, unlike what was becoming common at the time, whereby an aircraft was supposed to seed silver iodide on top of a cloud, this experiment requires a rain rocket which was shot into the air, into the clouds, so that it could seed the chemical to induce rain. The experiment was done in early 1964, actually 1963 to the 1964 season, because the rain and farming season in Zimbabwe is from October to April. So this experiment was carried out in towards the end of 1963 for the 1963 to 64 season. It produced disappointing results, 16% success rate out of about 111 rockets that were fired. Less than 20 produced any meaningful results. So immediately, the government stopped this experiment because of the failure, because it could not produce the desired results. But because this drought was ravaging the farming communities, the settler farmers did not stop or actually continued from where the government had left. So these settler farmers had socio-economic and political links with farmers businesses in South Africa, because some of them had actually migrated from South Africa to colonial Zimbabwe. So using these existing networks, they actually, throughout 1964, purchased rain rockets, especially from the Cape, transported them via rail, and continued experimenting with rain rockets. That was to create a tension with the government at some point, because some rain rockets were interrupting aircraft landing or departure at some airdromes. So at some point, there was actually a warning from the government that you should stop with those rain rockets. But eventually, the government gave in and assisted the farmers with information about the times when they were expecting aircraft or planes to land, so that they could not coincide with the firing of rain rockets. But again, because this had not been a successful experiment, so throughout 1964, the farmers did not succeed in inducing rain through the rain rockets experiment. And that book cover here is basically trying to summarize the story of a Rhodesian farmer, where there was always hope that next year it will be better as a result of various challenges that they faced, be it climatic conditions or some other serious problems, such as the failure to actually secure adequate labor due to many reasons. So after the failure in 1964-66, another drought was blooming in 1968. And as a way of trying to be proactive, the government, through the Meteorological Services Department, it actually become better at trying to avoid the rain rockets experiments and use aircrafts to do cloud seeding or to experiment with cloud seeding. This was led by one of the richest groups. Among the different farming groups, there were others who were performing fairly well, depending on the crops that they were producing. The sugar industry was one of the wealthy group of farmers, and they began sponsoring or sub-financing the Meteorological Services Department to carry out experiments in their localized areas for their own benefits. So in 1968, because of the looming drought in 1968, it also necessitated the resumption of experiments, but this time not through rain rockets, actually using aircraft to drop silver iodide on top of particular clouds. It was repeated in 1969. Then in 1973, there is a national drought relief cloud seeding operation that is launched to make it nationwide operation that could be carried out in 2 cities, Harare, the capital, which was Salisbury by then, and Bulawayo, the second capital, or the second largest city. So these 2 cities were supposed to then, that's where the cloud seeding experiments, the national, were supposed to be carried out, and they were supposed to cover all the regions within their nearby areas. So between 1973 and 1980, you have an annual cloud seeding operation that was conducted around October and November to try and avert drought. Where I am with the research, I'm not yet convinced that this was successful. Of course, there's only one serious drought in 1976. 1978 is not as huge, but I'm not sure if this is because of cloud seeding experiments or because there were no significant droughts during the period. But that's besides the point. Interestingly, in these annual experiments that were carried out, you often had challenges with securing, because during this period, 1965 to 1979, the country is at war. Indigenous people are fighting for independence. So there was always a challenge in securing the aircraft to do cloud seeding. And eventually, there is an aircraft that is dedicated to annual cloud seeding experiments. And it was given an interesting name, which is indigenous name. It was named Chaminuka. And it's given an indigenous name by the colonial government. And that indigenous name is of an ancestral spirit who had died in the early years of colonialism, when there was a first rebellion against colonialism. So Chaminuka is regarded by the indigenous people as an ancestral spirit of the land. And these ancestral spirits were also part of those which were propitiated by indigenous people when they are praying for rain. There is an interesting imagination of the colonial government by naming their own aircraft Chaminuka, which was responsible for cloud seeding experiments. Perhaps they were going beyond science, perhaps they're trying to appease local people in the context of the war, but there is a lot to imagine and talk about regarding the naming of that aircraft alone. But regarding these experiments that are being carried out during this period, I'm more interested in what I'm calling climate politics, the relations that are being shaped by these real or imagined efforts at controlling the environment. The first nature of climate politics occurred at regional level. And at regional level, it included the two neighboring countries of Zimbabwe, which is Malawi and Zambia. So the history behind is that between 1952 and 1962, for a decade, these countries merged into a federation, what is named the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, or the Central African Federation, which was basically the colonial government, the imperial British government actually, trying to ensure some easy administration over the three colonies and merging them into a federation. But when they form a federation, Rhodesia is sort of a powerful member of the federation because it's a settler colony with a huge settler population and a better economy compared to the other two. Actually, there had been a history of labor migration from Malawi and Zambia to Rhodesia. So as a result of its power, it is the Rhodesian Meteorological Services Department that is made the Federal Meteorological Services Department. So after the collapse of the Federation in 1962, immediately in 1964, the other two countries are granted independence through negotiation. Malawi and Zambia gain independence through negotiation. But in Southern Rhodesia, the settlers refused to offer majority rule to the indigenous people. And immediately they cut off their link with the imperial office in Britain, and they declare themselves independent through what they called Unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1965, led by Ian Smith. The British responded by sanctioning Rhodesia. The United Nations sanctioned Rhodesia, and then it's operating in an environment where it's fighting sanctions. So it is implementing various strategies to try and fight sanctions. But regarding that federation that had collapsed, Rhodesia remained in control of the meteorological services of these former partners of the federation. It remained responsible for the weather forecasts of the independent territories, yet it was still the colonial territory. So in 1973, when Rhodesia launches its national drought cloud seeding operation as a drought response strategy, because the droughts are also regional. They are not isolated to Zimbabwe, just like the current drought in Southern Africa and El Nino, and as a result of El Nino effect, it's affecting the whole region. So because these droughts are affecting the whole regions, and in Rhodesia, there's news that they are launching a national cloud seeding operation at a time where drought is looming in the neighboring countries. The neighboring countries then accuse Southern Rhodesia of weather warfare. They thought Southern Rhodesia is tampering with their climate or is tampering with their weather to try and control the amount of rain that they receive, because they were actually implementing the UN sanctions, the trade embargoes that they were not allowed to trade with Southern Rhodesia. So as a result of that, they think Southern Rhodesia, which is tampering with its with their climate. So there's a hostile relations that are created. Already there was bad relations as a result of Zambia supporting the Zimbabwe's war of liberation against the colonial regime in Zimbabwe. So these relations are made, they become worse as a result of this idea that colonial Zimbabwean might have been tampering with the environment or with the weather, the climatic conditions of the neighboring countries, actually contributing to drought. This was not limited to Southern Africa. At this point in time, even the US is being accused by some Asian countries, by some Latin American countries, of actually of the same accusation of weather warfare. It's being accused of some flooding and some cloud dispersion, both cloud dispersion and seeding in Vietnam. It's also being accused of similar issues in Mexico. So as a result of what is happening at the global scale, Zambia and Malawi thought Zimbabwe, colonial Zimbabwe, might have been also using the similar strategies to try and control the environment. But at the local scale, the politics are sort of different. The climate politics are different, but still shaped by the idea of cloud seeding or the idea of weather modification in broad. At a local scale, there are different farming groups that have different interests in weather control. They also have different economic performance. First, there's the sugar industry, which is known as the Rhodesia sugar industry. It had a financial muscle, it had enough money to actually finance cloud seeding experiments. There's also the Tobacco Farmers Association. Then there is the maize farmers. Firstly, all these three required different forms of weather modification at different times. The tobacco farmers, because tobacco is a leafy crop, the harvest is the leaves themselves, they were very much affected by hail. So they wanted weather modification that included hail suppression. Yet they did not have enough funding to sponsor hail suppression. The sugar industry did not care much about hail suppression. They wanted cloud seeding that would enhance more rainfall in their catchment area so that their dams are filled and they could practice irrigation throughout the year outside the rain season. The maize farmers also wanted more rainfall during the farming season when they mostly planted. So there's a lot of tension that is ongoing among these different farmers. And in most cases, it's decided by the group with more money to invest to fund the Meteorological Services Department, because the Meteorological Services Department itself lacked adequate funding. So the Sugar Industry Board, rather the Rhodesia Sugar Industry, through the Sugar Industry Board, actually managed to manipulate the cloud seeding operations to ensure that they benefit the most out of it. With time, there are also other government sectors that are becoming more and more interested in trying to use their local budgets to contribute to cloud seeding, in particular the Health Department, the Water Department, and the Conservation Department. The Conservation Department was more interested also in hailstorm suppression as a result of its ideas about erosion that was becoming a problematic issue since the 1960s. So having different sectors that have relations that are shaped by this idea of cloud seeding, and they have different interests in cloud seeding at this point in time. And that happens a lot until 1980. So in 1980, colony then gains its independence, and those commercial farmers, those settler farmers, were holding on to huge tracts of land, continue to own these farms at least for the first 2 decades, 1980 to 2000. There's silence about cloud seeding during this time because the Meteorological Services Department is sort of changes in its operation. There's capital flight a bit, but there's also more importantly lack of expertise, as some of the people who were manning the Meteorological Services Department left at independence in 1980. So there are no more cloud seeding operations that are carried out by the state itself. But these farmers continue at group level, at individual level, to to organize and carry out these cloud seeding efforts without necessarily the involvement of the state. Because it's the same farmers who were financing cloud seeding operations in the colonial period who are still holding on to land. But because there is no longer an organized Meteorological Services Department which could continue with the operations, they did most of that privately. Now in 2000, there is a fast-track land reform program that is carried out, chaotic, violent, and these commercial farmers lose their land. The event actually created hostile relations between Zimbabwe and the EU, between Zimbabwe and the US. Zimbabwe is sanctioned by the EU, Zimbabwe is sanctioned by the US, among other countries, as a result of this violent land grab that had taken place in between 2000 and 2002. But because the people, majority of the farmers were holding on to huge tracts of land and producing and responsible in a way to the food security status of the country, had left. The immediate result of the fast-track land reform program was food insecurity. It was made worse by a huge drought in 2002 to 2003 that the country then found itself in a very difficult situation, relying on donations from different countries. And there is a lot of politicization of that drought, and eventually some climate politics that are also at play. So initially the drought is politicized as a result of political tensions that are going on. The food distribution follows political or party lines. There's a lot of nepotism in terms of food distribution, to an extent that some of the donors, including the US, then try to control how food is distributed. And the then President Robert Mugabe banned any donations, and he then accuses them of donating genetically modified maize that he thought was not good for the people. So he then banned those donations. But more importantly, he makes an accusation similar to what had been made by the neighboring countries in 1973, that this drought that was occurring in Zimbabwe was a result of some cloud dispersion by the United States government as a result of the fact that we took back our land. So again, he's implicating some climate politics, of course, without much of the evidence of it, but as a result of the tensions that are taking place during this point in time. And as a result, the silence about cloud seeding in the colony as a response in the post-colonial period as a result of lack of expertise and a lack of interest in most parts until the recent experiments. So there is a lot of climate policy that is taking on the colonial period and the post-colonial period that is shaped by the idea of weather modification, in particular, the idea of cloud seeding to enhance rainfall, the idea of cloud seeding as a drought response strategy. Some conclusions that I draw from this talk, from this research, is that first, cloud seeding efforts in 20th century Zimbabwe to the immediate 21st century can be seen as an Anthropocene moment in more ways than one. First, there is the idea of Anthropocene as imagined. Anthropocene is imagined in terms of how different sectors of the society imagined a weather, imagined humans controlling the weather, imagined how the weather would be like and the climate in general would be like if humans gained total control of the environment or of the weather itself. They were convinced that right in the 20th century, it was possible for humans to be able to deliver rain after a phone call. So there is Anthropocene as imagined. There is Anthropocene in action. And both Anthropocene as imagined, Anthropocene in action is shaping diplomatic, political relations within the country and within the region itself. But in all this, there's no absolute state control of this Anthropocene moment in both colonial and post-colonial Zimbabwe. The state makes efforts at researching about this technology, but the state does not have enough funding. It was also not having any external funding to carry out these experiments, and it relied on internal groups of people who were interested in dynamic or different aspects of weather control. So you do not have absolute state control over weather control or weather modification in both post-colonial and colonial and post-colonial Zimbabwe. And as a result, the interested groups had also a hand in how the cloud seeding, or in general, the weather modification aspects occurred throughout both the colonial and the post-colonial period. That brings me to the end of my talk.
Microphone is the whole room, so everyone outside. And it's quite clear for people who are online that they don't have.
Silence might mean people don't get whatever nonsense that I was speaking, or they still want to process and ask questions. Yes.
Much research done on that, or because I've not heard of that chemical and how it affects the environment. Useful,
Thank you. Would you prefer that I take each question or a round of questions, or what format would you?
Personally, I always like it if there's direct response.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you would just pile with more and more questions.
Thank you so much. Interesting question. So actually, what is more interesting is to try and look at whether that chemical had implications on the environment in general. But in terms of research about this chemical and its wide use, in colonial Zimbabwe itself, there was no much research about the chemical. They relied on importing the chemical. There was much research about the local conditions that could suit cloud seeding. So they imported the chemical. They also imported the whole idea through this idea of sending officials to international conferences and borrowing the whole idea, the whole technology was as a result of what they'd learned from outside countries. So at this point, I haven't really gathered any information about what could be the consequences of silver iodide that was seeded on clouds on the general environment. There are assumptions that some cloud seeding operations have misfired or backfired, either contributed to drought conditions or to floods. And that can be the beginning of trying to find out what could be the general environmental consequences beyond what is planned of this chemical.
A lot of things I have on my mind. One thing connects to what was just said, and it is a two-part question. The one is, how did the research then actually go on about that cloud seeding? Was there some, was it an actual research sort of university-based or whatever? Or was it just farmers trying it out because they were so central in doing it for a while? Or were they just trying it out and was a trial and error and see how we just throw something in and we see what's going to happen or not? Or was there actually a controlled sort of research process behind it? And the second part of the question is sort of, how does it tie in with international development? Sort of, where does Zimbabwe or this whole Rhodesian history sort of tie in with the international community. Is there any connection there? I mean, you mentioned some already, sort of they were learning from other countries. But I'm just thinking sort of this whole cloud seeding process, because it pops up in so many different places. I've mainly heard about it in China and a little bit about the States, Europe as well, a little bit, but so it seems to be a very sort of global phenomenon, actually. But is it all these places are just doing it by themselves, or is there an international
Combined
community around the whole thing as well?
Interesting question. So the first part about research. In the Meteorological Services Department itself, there is a research team that began to focus on how to make cloud seeding work better. And this team comprised of there was a committee that was set up in 1969, which was part of Ian Smith's Economic Council, because when he was now fighting sanctions from the UN, from the British, he came up with this Economic Council that joined sort of all the cabinet ministries among key departments and trying to strategize on several things. So that committee became part of the Economic Council to try and get government support, especially in funding, because it was one of the major problems. But it also became aligned to the then University College of Rhodesia, which is now the University of Zimbabwe. So there was an attempt to always get experts in trying to understand the weather patterns. And this research mainly focused on one of the challenges that was always happening with every annual cloud seeding operation was the efficiency of it was thought to be limited or enhanced by knowing the right clouds to seed. So much of the research annually towards each annual cloud seeding operation was to try and understand the right clouds to seed, and also to try and understand the occurrence of such clouds in different seasons and different months, because annual cloud seeding operations would take place anytime between October and December. So much of the research that was being carried out by the different experts who were brought in was to try and understand when do we mostly find the best clouds to seed, which are the best clouds to seed, among other things. So, and I think there's a lot more that is also being researched at this point in time that I might not have at this point come across, but there is indeed a research team within the Meteorological Services Department. But when in 1964, after the first experiment with rain rockets that failed, and post-1980, there are cases when farmers just carry out operations without necessarily the involvement of the Meteorological Services Department, and in most cases without much of research perhaps involved. Throughout 1994, when rain rockets were used, it was individual farmers basically shooting clouds and trying to induce rain. So especially in those cases where individual farmers are carrying out their own experiments, there was less research involved. But throughout the 1970s, there's an effort to incorporate research and try to ensure precision and try to improve efficiency. Then in terms of coordinated effort with other countries, I so far come across an interesting anecdote about the US government discussions in 1974, where the US government was thinking of having a coordinated, perhaps global in a way, cloud seeding operation. And it identified countries that were interested. Among the lists include Canada and Rhodesia features among the list of countries that were interested in an international coordinated effort. But then this is best understood within the politics of the time. The US was, at this point in time, using weather modification as part of its foreign policy as well. So it was looking for, in its search for partners, it was also part of the foreign policy, the core politics of trying to look for the proxies or partners within the existing politics. So there is an attempt to partner other governments, to partner other countries, but they've not been really put into practice until 1980, because the national drought cloud seeding operation of 1973 happens 7 years before independence, and in 7 years' time, the country gains independence, and the trajectory changes almost altogether. So there's a lot of discussion about looking for partners, other governments that could partner, but none so far have I seen that actually came into practice. There's also an issue of commercial, what they called commercial seeders. Basically, they were organizations, companies, private companies, which could be hired to come and carry out the cloud seeding operation on behalf of the government. And it is constantly mentioned in almost every report since Meteorological Services Department report since 1973. And the excuse is that these were very expensive because they were private companies that were there to carry out an operation on behalf of the government, and the government did not afford its own cloud seeding operation, so it was not ready to hire international, rather foreign companies. But that's also another aspect of partnering the outside world that was thought of, but never practiced as a result of financial limitations. I don't know if that answers you.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm wondering a little about the whole idea of cloud seeding, to be honest, especially when you mentioned that only certain clouds can be seeded to drop rains. So when there's a drought, where's the cloud to be seeded so it would rain? That's the first thing I was wondering a lot about. And then also the whole research. I mean, they've been doing research during the time from 63 to 64, I think they did take 10. So you mentioned also the farmers who were driving the whole experiments, but who else, like, what was the Zimbabwean opinion, the local opinion about these researchers? Was there any knowledge back in this time? And also to make the bridge to nowadays, do they know what there's happening in the rain cloud seeding program of the government? And also concerning what Mnangagwa said, he wants to remove the chairs of the communities, the chiefs of the communities. So I'm asking rather, is it a question of power? Because I think his nickname is the crocodile and had something to do with the shoulder war back. So yeah, I'm wondering where exactly, where's the Zimbabwean drivers of cloud seeding kind of, what do you think or can say to that?
Thank you so much. Interesting set of questions. I hope I captured all of them in my mind, but I'll ask you to remind me some if I missed them. So first, the whole idea of cloud seeding. So some scholars have actually argued that it's almost non-existent. It doesn't work because, first of all, the naming itself, cloud seeding, sounds like it actually seeds clouds where they don't exist. Yet, in actual fact, as I mentioned before, it's all about identifying clouds that are most likely that are likely to rain, but either they will rain later or they are likely to rain, but perhaps the 50-50 chance. So it's clouds that already contain rain that have to be identified, and then the chemical dropped on them so that chances of rain or chance of those clouds producing rain can be enhanced. So what that means is when there is a drought or a possibility of drought, it's most likely that such clouds might be very few or non-existent. And as a result, you then have droughts actually occurring even after cloud seeding experiments, which is common in the period when they are practicing. even the reason why rain rockets failed when elsewhere they had been seen to be efficient. So the whole idea means even the only article on Zimbabwe that talks about the role of cloud seeding in maize output, it actually talks about how the experiments that they used in that article were carried out in an area that already receives normal to above normal rainfall. So what could be what then becomes known about the output is if the amount of rain was going to be 100 millimeters, perhaps it's going to be 1.5. But if it was going to be 0, chances are that it might remain 0. So it's all about enhancing what is already potential. And it's all about identifying potential, cloud with potential rain, and making that potential increased. So that's where the trick is. And that's where mostly in this period in time, I'm not sure about the science about it now, but at least back then, that's how the whole idea, or that's what the whole idea was. Then with regards to knowledge at society level, it's one thing that I'm still exploring from the from 1964. At least up to 1964, there are various comments, mostly magazines and newspapers record what people think, or where people write in newspapers as guest appearance, among other things. Those can be anecdotes which I use to try and get what people were thinking about cloud seeding. So before the actual annual operations, which is where I am now with reading various newspapers. The challenge with these newspapers that they're not digitized. You have to go physically to the archive, read them one by one, and other things, request them actually one by one, sometimes missing and other things. So it really takes a lot. And now I'm in 1964. But beyond that, it's more interesting to look at how, when the annual cloud seeding operations were being carried out, what did people think about that? But now about the present situation, where the president, Emerson Mnangagwa, nicknamed Crocodile, like you say, is making threatening statements about him removing chiefs if rains don't fall. Well, his statements are not limited to that. They're just like that on everything in any case. But he is, on that particular case, is really demonstrating how, in his imagination of what artificial insimulation of rain might mean, or artificial rain might mean, is both cultural and scientific, so to speak. The scientific side is when his government, Meteorological Services Department, under his government, is launching a cloud seeding experiment. So they sort of the belief in science that we can do this as a drought response strategy. But the cultural aspect is when, in the previous year, before he made these threats, he had credited himself for the good rains. And he said, I ordered the chiefs to renew the traditional rain-making ceremony. And that's the reason why we have these good rains for this season, and we have a bumper harvest. So credit to me, credit to the chiefs. I ordered them to do the annual traditional rain-making ceremony. They did that. We have good rains. Now a drought is looming. He asked the chiefs to conduct the ceremony, and he then makes that threat that if you don't do that, or if we don't receive rain, it means you haven't conducted the ceremony. So he then makes that threat that I will remove you from the position, which perhaps was not that serious. But basically, he's trying to emphasize the idea that I believe that the chiefs should conduct annual rain-making ceremonies to induce rain. And that gives us also an idea about the society at large, what it thinks. The idea of cloud seeding operation, the recent ones from 2022, 2023, I was reading a newspaper about January 2024 launch again. Actually, it started in around November, when regional forecasts were predicting a drought in the region because of the effect of El Nino. And then state media in Zimbabwe was promising a bumper harvest, saying that we have the Meteorological Services Department is going to do a cloud seeding operation. In January, they repeated the same. The efficiency of it is difficult to measure, but basically, these are not either widely talked about in different media, including social media itself, compared to how the ideas of traditional rainmaking ceremonies are talked about. I've published a paper on traditional rainmaking ceremonies, and I've visited this particular community in the Midlands province during the time I was researching on that paper, and also afterwards when I was researching on how they basically use traditional means to predict rain, to do traditional weather forecasting. And you have these ideas about rainmaking in these communities, in these rural farming communities. They are the most dominant compared to cloud seeding operations, which are barely known that there's a cloud seeding operation that is ongoing. So I must say, society in present day, and by the society, I'm specifically referring to the peasant societies in the rural areas who are engaged in farming. They don't know much about cloud seeding experiments. They know much about what they do in practice through their chiefs or their small at their small community level, ancestral spirits propitiating ancestors for rain, something that they do annually. So that's much of how to artificially induce rain that they know, or that is commonly taught at community level.
What is about the techniques to preserve rain, but not only to pray for rain, but also like to keep it in the ground, or also to have basins to collect it, like how much what's the agriculture before the colonization in Zimbabwe, or like there must have been some techniques, or there even techniques nowadays. So wasn't it rather better to think about it, to do more research in that direction, or?
So the traditional rainmaking ceremony predates colonialism. It's something that has existed before and continues to exist today, despite also getting modified based on culture is always changing. So am I right to say that your question is asking why the government is thinking along the techniques that emerged in the colonial to the post-colonial period instead of the traditional pre-colonial period?
Well, yeah, it's. I think it's like that.
Why are they thinking along those lines?
Why not calling like to all the techniques and to bring that to the people instead of saying, well, let's outpraise the rain, but to remember what we've done or what there was already on, management techniques or whatever.
Yeah, I remember conducting oral interviews about traditional weather forecasting. That how do you, way back now, without the use of radio, without the Meteorological Services Department, how do you predict that you're going to have a good rainfall season? How do you predict that? How do you do weather forecast? So I got different responses mainly from different age groups. Most of the elderly talk about the traditional weather forecasting ideas. They know when certain birds sing and sing in a particular way, they know that certainly that week is going to rain. Those birds are seasonal birds, they appear during the rain season. So they can know that this week we expect rain. Particular frogs, they hear particular frogs screaming from the river. They know that perhaps that particular evening they can expect rain. Wild fruit-bearing trees, if they have abundant fruits or not so abundant fruits, it means ABC. That's what they've traditionally known. In that local community where I conducted oral interviews, they actually talked about a local mountain which used to burn a veld fire on top of the mountain. So they told me that traditionally, this mountain used to burn. A wildfire used to occur on top of the mountain, and it occurred in October. Every October, the rain season begins in October. So they said when the fire starts, we know that the rain season is approaching, and that fire is only stopped by the first rains which we use for planting. And I asked them, why do you think it's no longer happening? Scientific reasoning or approach would basically be that there's climate change, so the wildfire, the natural wildfire is no longer happening. But they think the mountain is defiled. The youths have been practicing artisanal mining chrome gold around the mountain, so that they defiled the mountain because they think it's a sacred mountain. But that's a different age group. Another age group talks about a lot about the radio, that weather forecasting, well, our fathers, grandfathers talk about birds, talk about other things, but all we know is what we hear from the radio. But they also have a further interesting narrative shaped by politics. That also all we know is that every election year is a drought year. And this is basically because in every election year, when the ruling party is campaigning, it dishes out free food. And in most cases, it will be experiencing drought. It can coincide with a drought. For elections that are held 5 years, that 5-year period can coincide with a drought, and there are free food donations. So they characterize election years with drought. So there are different ways within which people use to imagine the climate and also to try and predict a bad harvest, a good harvest at societal level. And those techniques also involve listening to the radio, listening to what the weather person is going to say about the forecast. But they also interestingly include the traditional forecast system, how traditionally people have relied on nature to try and predict a good rainfall season, among other things. I don't know if that sort of answers it.
Gave a broad lens about how you go to the podcast, but I hope it works. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I have some questions, but I also have the chance to ask them later. So if any wants to ask. All right. Well, I'm also curious about the first slide. So this re-emergence of cloud seeding being considered as an option and being sold also to the public. I wonder what the narrative is there, because we did something on this huge project transferring water from southern China to northern China, and I was very struck by how green the narrative was. How there's a kind of green developmentalist lens there that doesn't simply say, "Oh, we want to create so much industrial output or agricultural output in the north, so we're going to seed clouds," but it says there's actually too much water in the south, and we have floods, and looks at all these. The dams are sometimes too full, so the dams become a problem. That interacts with these green critiques of earlier development periods, and this is really nice that you look at several periods of narratives. Several narratives over time. And I'm wondering if they found a new sort of green developmentalist narratives, and whether they, the examples they're bringing, that cloud seeding can work, maybe they're also China or something, also part of this narrative. And then at the same time, trying to think what the responses might be. And this is really new now that we have probably friendships or access to movements representing the kinds of diversified farmers who are sort of dissociated, at least to some degree, from these huge monocultures that require rainfall at a specific time and create this critical mass to actually fund rockets and aircrafts to provide them. What do they think about this reappearing?
Interesting. Unfortunately, in Zimbabwe, we don't really have much of environmental activists, which then means that narrative, at least from an environmental perspective, lacks. Most of our environmental activists are us who shout on social media that mining in the national parks is destroying the environment and highlighting all these things, but it's basically on social media without really much coordinated effort on the ground. There's a whole organization, Environmental Management Agency, formed, I think, in 2001, part of the government. So obviously it okays all these deals of mining in the national parks, construction on wetlands, among other things. So, but coordinated efforts, non-governmental organizations, civil society, are responding to all these things is very limited, almost invisible. But regarding the narrative, how the narrative was pushed, so far I've really followed state media, which is reported on the issue widely compared to non-state media. The difference between state and non-state media in Zimbabwe is very important because state media is the propaganda mouthpiece of the state. It praises the ruling party which fought the liberation war, and so they deserve to rule the country no matter whatever way they want, among other things. So in state media, the narrative has largely been that it has largely been centered on propaganda. And because these are recent experiments that started after the current president came in 2017. The current president in state media has been portrayed as a visionary leader, as someone who is transforming the economy. So the narrative that is set, actually just before he came into the office in 2017, he was the vice president, and he was he oversaw an agricultural policy that was named Command Agriculture. I don't know how they sat down and settled on such a name, but Command Agriculture then coincided with a successful rain season, resulting in a good harvest. So all credit was given to him when he came into power in 2017, when the first season of Command Agriculture. So now with the cloud seeding experiment, state media reports about much of state media's reports, first page of the Herald newspaper will always have the president of the country on the first page, a picture of the president of the country doing something. There's always a way of trying to create a narrative that is centered on the president of the country, that he is the best, he's doing this, he's either officiating at this ceremony, opening this wonderful project and other things. So even a report about a cloud seeding experiment will go on to be told about the president's vision 2030, among many other things. So the narrative in the media, in state media, has been manipulated to, instead of focusing on the environmental aspect of all this, it has been so political, talking about the achievements of the president in doing this. The Zimbabwe Farmers Union has sort of followed suit because the president of such an organization is interviewed by the state media to comment about this. So all he does is showering praises that droughts are going to be a thing of the past because of this innovative approach by our president, among other things. So the narrative has really been centered, it's been political propaganda in nature, centered on praising the regime, the government on the initiative, instead of going environmental and talking about perhaps how they came up with this whole idea and why. Part of my research about this project, I'm thinking of actually identifying a person in the Meteorological Services Department to sort of collaborate with and in a way, get information from the Meteorological Services Department, which I know that on myself, I won't be able to do. So I really want to get a perspective from the current Meteorological Services Department in its current form, how and when, because if the experiment was done in 2022, it means there've been some research, some thoughts into it, how they come up with it, and why. Are they borrowing from the colonial way? With the change of international relations, now they thinking about what they call look east policy, friendship with China, among other Asian countries. What is really occurring with the current cloud seeding experiment? So it's the direction that I'm thinking of taking with the project. I think there was a second part of your question that I didn't answer.
Started with you kind of talked about the Farmers Union. I imagine, I mean, Via Campesina was home in Harare for a while, so I'm curious. I mean, that's the Farmers Union you're talking about.
Yeah.
So because that's very aligned with the government.
Yeah.
Then, so you might.
Thank you. Very interesting question. Yes.
I have another question. I'm wondering, was so much effort being done for this technique, with so little outcome, while there's so many other techniques out there, with much better results. For example, in the drought zone in Niger, there are examples that it's possible to green the desert with trees and having moisture on the soil and other things. And well, this technique is quite expensive, and I can't see really good results from it. So I'm questioning the technique a little. And on the other hand, the question is, because I've been to Zimbabwe and in Harare, and there's no tap water, even close to the government department. There's no tap water at all for weeks. Now you have to carry your own water, and I'm wondering that they're just paying so much attention and money to this technique, and, while the people suffering, there's not really an outcome.
Yeah.
And one last thing, sorry.
No problem.
Is for me, it all sounds like the result from colonialism. So ancient people in Zimbabwe, they didn't know how to grow their things. I've talked with rural people, and they told me, yeah, we plant our seeds before October, and then rain will come, and after April, we have our harvest for the whole year. And, even with maize, it's only a problem. Had better crops like Apoko and
Sorghum.
sorghum, yeah. Thanks. And yeah, that would be better for climate change than shooting rockets.
Interesting, yeah. So good observation that it's more continuation of some colonial experiments that even in the colonial period, it's difficult to show if they yielded any good results. So is it really worth it to do that now? Especially considering the fact that if you had to talk of or to think about the Harare water challenge in present day, even Bulawayo's water challenges in present day, you realize that well, drought might contribute, but lack of infrastructure is the biggest challenge. Construction of just big dams, perennial rivers exists where water can be extracted from to provide. So why not invest in something that is certain? In Bulawayo, there's a project that was designed by the colonial government in 1911 called the Zambezi Water Project on the big Zambezi River that was supposed to supply water to Bulawayo. The colonial government never developed it due to financial reasons. It was never very much interested in it, but it designed it. Post-colonial government to date has never done anything meaningful about it. Of late, they've resumed the plans, but this is something that is certain that if a pipeline is connected from Zambezi to supply Bulawayo, there will be efficient water for Bulawayo, instead of guessing that if we shoot if we shoot clouds, we can solve the water problem. So like I said, if I'm lucky to be able to get access to the Meteorological Services Department in its current form, I'll be more interested in the research that they put to make a decision to relaunch these cloud seeding operations in the 21st century. What solutions really are they trying to, or what problems are they trying to solve? Are they thinking that it shall solve water problems in the country? Are there no better solutions to the water challenges in the country compared to such ideas, among other things? So yeah, if I'm lucky enough to get access to those to the Meteorological Services Department, I think I might come up with something good.
Maybe one last question, just not quite concerning the water system, but Zimbabwe in general. Like Mnangagwa, he's got a new parliament building, which was paid by the Chinese. How is the independency level of Zimbabwe when the Chinese government pays for the parliament building of Zimbabwe?
Impressive one. So there've been a lot of conspiracies about that, and one of them that is my favorite is that that's the parliament, which was constructed, funded by the Chinese, is a deal that allows the Chinese to be granted mining rights everywhere where they find minerals in the country. They've been accused of mining in one of the biggest parks, Wange National Park, and their mining activities across the country are sort of contributing a lot to environmental degradation. Nothing happens to them. So it's sort of linked to these type of deals where they fund a project so that behind the scenes they get huge favors. They've been granted a lot of mining rights, lithium mining, lithium that has been recently discovered in the country, and they've gotten some funny, interesting exemptions. So in the, I think, 2023 to 4 national budget, they introduced a regulation that no mining company is supposed to export raw lithium. They're supposed to do some beneficiation, so that at least there is some industries that benefit employment, among other things, instead of exporting raw lithium. Then the regulation stipulated that there can be some exemptions. If you follow, companies that have been given exemptions are Chinese companies. So it really speaks to the idea of how independent is a country that is its parliament constructed by or funded by the Chinese. But perhaps that's not unique to Zimbabwe. The African Union Parliament itself was also, rather HQ was also recently funded by China itself, and there've been thoughts about what if bugs are installed, and everything that you discuss there is recorded and known in China. So there are interesting dynamics to all these things, and it speaks a lot to Sino-Africa relations, which some begin to think about as some new imperialism of sort. Yeah.
Real too. Quite a lot.